You would find the book of Philippians, the first chapter. That's where we're at. Good to get back here, honestly. I've been gone for a couple weeks. The opportunity, I don't know, when I first retired, the pastor of my father's, where my dad goes to church, called me and asked me if I would come and preach. Well, he was only 98 at the time. And so I thought, well, he's 98. He may not live very long. I'd better go. So I made an appointment. It was great to go and preach in his church, and picked him up and brought him to church and then took him home. He just keeps hanging around. And so every year, the pastor at First Baptist Church Mount Zion gives me a call and says, would you like to come and preach for your dad? And so I had my dad, who's now 102. So he got to church, and he's kind of a miracle. Karen and I have struggled with this. My dad's 102, still doing pretty well. Karen's mom is 89. She bowls twice a week. She still drives. We could be stuck with each other a long time if the gene pools carry on. We don't know how that'll work. But I had a chance to visit with my dad. It's also Memorial Day. And this idea, my dad was a veteran in World War II. Not very many veterans left from World War II. That's a whole generation of part of the heritage we have as a country that's beginning to fade. And I think more about that. My dad's brothers, he was a farm family over in Ewing, Illinois, and all three of the brothers ended up in the military. My dad in the Navy, the other two in the Army, and his oldest brother was killed. Dad was in Hawaiian Islands, serving there. His brother, we really don't know exactly where he was, but I kind of got the possession. I have the telegram that the War Department sent to my grandparents, to his father, mother, saying, your son has been wounded. And then 21 days later, they get another telegram saying, your son died of his wounds. And I have the Purple Heart. I thought about bringing it today. That they sent to that little town in southern Illinois where a young boy had gone off to serve his country and death had come. So there's something good for us. I think Christians, as the concept of sacrifice, we really ought to be able to understand Memorial Day better than maybe the rest of the population. So I think that's something worthwhile saying. But also, today, we're going to look at a difficult idea, a difficult concept of what do you do when tragedy strikes your family? What do you do when hard things happen? What do you do when the difficulties of the world just sort of come in on you? Now, I hope that some of you will say, hey, that'll be great, preacher, but I don't need that today. Everything's good in my house. I mean, we are doing great. Everybody's healthy. You know, finances are good. No problems with my kids are great. Everybody's doing great. And if you don't need it today, that's fine. Just be really thankful and really humble, because you're going to need it someday. But it has to do with the Apostle Paul. And remember, he's been in Philippi, and he's visited with them, and he's sort of eventually kicked out of town by the people in the community after the earthquake, and after he's been arrested and beaten and thrown in prison, and God sort of does a miracle, and he leaves. And he's now in prison in Rome. And he's written this letter, and it's kind of like there's the elephant in the room is, well, Paul, you've been this missionary, this pastor, you've led us to Christ. Why have all these bad things happened to you? And Paul's going to address that in the passage we're looking at today. So, beginning in chapter 1, verse 12. I want you to know, brothers, that what has happened to me has really served to advance the gospel, so that it has become known throughout the whole imperial guard to all the rest that my imprisonment is for Christ. And most of the brothers, having become confident in the Lord by my imprisonment, are much more bold to speak the word without fear. Some indeed preach Christ from envy and rivalry, but others from goodwill. The latter do it out of love, knowing that I am put here for the defense of the gospel. The former proclaim Christ out of selfish ambition, not sincerely, but thinking to afflict me in my imprisonment. What then? Only that in every way, whether in pretense or in truth, Christ is proclaimed, and in that I rejoice. Yes, and I will rejoice. For I know that through your prayers and the help of the Holy Spirit, Jesus Christ, this will turn out for my deliverance, as it is my eager expectation and hope that I will not be at all ashamed, but with full courage, now as always, Christ will be honored in my body, whether by life or by death. What has happened to me? Well, I guess we need to revisit that just a little bit. What has happened to Paul? Well, after he's basically escorted out of town in the city of Philippi, he comes south into Greece. A little farther, he goes to Thessalonica, he goes to Athens, he goes to Corinth, he goes back and visits Ephesus again, and then in the book of Acts, Paul goes back to Jerusalem. And while he's there, he meets with the apostles, and he meets with the church, and he goes to the temple, and a rumor starts in the city of Jerusalem. It's not true, but gospel said that Paul, because he's been a minister to the Gentiles, has taken some Gentiles into the court of Israel in the temple. And a riot breaks out. That's not true. It's lies. It's gossip. But the riot breaks out, and the Roman soldiers come in basically to kind of save Paul from being murdered right there. And then there's a trial before the Sanhedrin. And the trial goes well. Paul kind of is just a little ornery. He says he's on trial for the resurrection of the dead. I think we've talked, the Pharisees believed in the resurrection. The Sadducees didn't believe in the resurrection. So that kind of ended up. And then there's 40 or so men swear an oath not to eat or to drink until Paul has been murdered. And then they get a plan where they're going to ask the Romans to bring Paul back to the Sanhedrin again, and on the way they're going to murder him. Well, the plot gets out, and so all these people, Paul's in prison, he has no reason to be there, it's all lies, but he's rushed out of town, and he goes to Caesarea, and he's in prison in Caesarea for 2 whole years. He talks to Festus and Agrippa and other leaders, and finally he appeals to Rome. But what that meant was that every Roman citizen, and Paul was a Roman citizen, that's a big deal, has the right to appeal to Caesar. Now what that meant was, pretty much at your own expense, you could go to Rome and have Caesar deal with your trial, your case. Well, once you do that, that's kind of, it's a done deal, but you do it at your own expense. And so Paul gets on a ship, and talk about going through storms, he actually does. There's a shipwreck. But finally, he ends up in Rome, and he's there for at least 2 years. So he's already been in prison almost 5 years. He's sometime in Mamertine prison, which is like a real thick cave with bars. He's in a really nasty place. Mamertine prison was terrible, and we know that Paul was there for a while. When he has financial help, like the Philippians who've taken up the offer and sent it to him, he, for a period of time, because people who appealed to Caesar were political prisoners, he could rent his own house. He still had a guard with him. He probably still had manacles, chains on him. He was still a prisoner. But we know at the very end of the book of Acts, Paul has already been in a rented house for 2 whole years, waiting for his trial to be called before Caesar. So every day he gets up. At some point, Caesar could just say, well, I'm going to hear some trials today. Pull up the records. Who's on the list? And Caesar did it whenever he wanted to. There's no such thing as speedy trials. They didn't give that in those days. Just kind of hung around. But any day that Paul woke up, the word could have come, Caesar's going to hear your trial today. And he would go before Caesar, make his defense, and before the end of the day, he would either be put to death, or he would be set free, or just be put back in prison. So Paul is living in this uncertainty. And this question of, Paul, you're this godly man, you're the preacher of the gospel. How did all of this stuff happen? How did you get into this mess? Well, we don't understand. Why get to where Paul chooses to address those difficult things, let me just talk with you basically, why do bad things happen to good people? In fact, why do bad things happen in the world? And the theological quick answer is sin. The reality is that basically every bad thing that happens in this world can be traced in some way back to sin. And the first place, and the one that most of us don't really like to talk about, is sometimes the messes we find ourselves in are our own choices and decisions. Our own sins. Our own things have come home to roost. And do I get this wrong, or do we not have a world that pretty much wants to blame everybody for whatever happens to you? I mean, what we really want is somebody we can blame and sue. That just sort of seems to be the mindset in America. But one of the basic principles of Christianity is that I am personally responsible for my life, for my actions, for my decisions. And when I mess up, there's not really anybody else I can blame. Some of my problems are my own choices and decisions, consequences to my sin. Sometimes, tragically, other people sin. And their sin not only affects them, but it ends up affecting other people. Somebody gets behind the wheel of a car under the influence of alcohol. They're probably going to pay for that in some way, but you understand that their sin and their choices and their decisions are very likely going to intersect with some other family, some other individual, and tragedy is going to come because of that other person's decision. Some are mine, but sometimes if you live long enough, you and I will experience the grief and the sorrow and the heartache of the sins of our children, the sins of our parents, the sins of family members, the sins of other individuals, and their sin and the consequences of their sin will sometimes intersect with you and with me, and it is hard. And that's kind of one of the things that's happened for Paul. The sinful Sanhedrin, the gossip, the decisions of other people, people's anger, people's bitterness has now come home, and part of where Paul is at is because of other people's choices. There are some things, to be honest, some bad things that are not really anybody's fault. This is a hard one for us sometimes. We live in a world that has been tainted by sin. In the Garden of Eden, as far as I know, there was no cancer. No doctors were needed. We could just do without it. We didn't care. There was no insurance. None of that was necessary. Everything was good. No heart disease, no cancer, no tragedies, nothing. But when sin entered the world, the Bible teaches that the world, nature itself, fell. And death and disease entered. And there are some things that happen that really are not anybody's fault. Now, I know it gets a little complicated. If you've smoked for 45 years and you get lung cancer, you can't just blame that on nature. You got some personal responsibility. But the reality is that there are folks who get doctors' diagnosis that it's not really anybody's fault. We just live in a world where death is going to come. And consequently, we also live in a world where life is frail and there are accidents. There are things that are not real. They're just things that happen in the world because we live in a sinful, fallen world, and that's the case. But the reality is bad things happen. I will tell you that I'm always very reluctant to blame bad things on God. The Bible says God is not the author of evil. I suppose there can be a situation, Job, by the way, that's kind of a special case, just between God and Satan, and they were working out a deal, and God took care of Job in the midst of it. It can be that God would allow something to happen in my life or your life to get our attention, but He has the Holy Spirit. I think He speaks to hearts. And if you have to wonder whether or not something is God doing it in your life, then if He does it, it's going to be so clear there's no question at all. But the reality is stuff happens. That's just part of living in the world that we live in. And from the time we are born until the time we die, you and I are going to be expected and experience difficult things. And so from the Apostle Paul in this little space, I think first of all you get some really good ideas on how to deal with it. So Paul in this situation, sitting in prison, not sure what's going to happen, doesn't know whether he's going to be called and put to death by the end of the day. He has no idea, this terrible situation of uncertainty. First of all, Paul chooses to not be bitter. I mean, would he not have had a right to be angry? I mean, wouldn't he have a right to just, those guys, they lied about me. I wouldn't be here if it wasn't for them. And he chooses not to be angry. There's a thing biblically called the root of bitterness. And I will tell you the way I see a lot of it happen, when things are happening and I'm not in control. When things are going on and stuff's happening and I can't change it. I'm stuck living with this stuff. That the very frustration of not being in control brings anger. And most of us want to put that anger in a target. We want to blame it on somebody. We want it to be somebody's fault. We want to blame somebody. But Paul moves past that. And I will tell you, there is nothing like spiritual cancer any closer than anger and bitterness. Paul chooses not to be angry. In fact, in the very thing, hey, all this stuff has happened. Guess what? It's okay. This idea, and let me tell you, the answer for a lot of the bitterness in the world is forgiveness. I mean, that's really the answer. When somebody else's life has brought grief into your heart, boy, it's hard. Forgiveness. Sometimes there are people who beat themselves up and become angry themselves and miserable because of their own mistakes and forgiveness. Sometimes you just need to not let bitterness win. When you find yourself, and I see a lot of people who spend all their time in a kind of little pity party, and they're miserable and they're unhappy and they refuse to choose anything beyond the anger. And by the way, if you're around those people, they usually don't want you to be happy either. You do know that. Paul begins by choosing not to be bitter. Secondly, he chooses to trust that God is still in control. When you're not in control, when you're at the emergency room, you're at the funeral home, when you're looking at the bills that you have no idea how you're going to pay, when the people around you are making choices and decisions that are breaking your heart, when those things are going and you are not in control, Paul chooses to see that God is in control. He doesn't know what's going to happen tomorrow. He doesn't know what's going to happen before the day is over, but he says, God's got this. God is in control. That's the element of faith, and it's part of how you and I mean, it's one thing to trust God when everything's going great. But I will tell you, it's something else when you trust God when things are happening that you don't know how to stop. Kind of had a situation with First Baptist Church Effingham. They're getting ready to do a building program, and I recorded a video this week and to kind of use, and they were asking a question about somebody left some money to the church, and by the way, maybe it's not a bad one to do. A family in the church had left them $350,000, and they're wanting to remodel their children's wing. And so they asked me, so what do you think Herb and Ethel would think about using that money for a new children's wing? Well, I was able to say, Herb and Ethel, who loved their church, were never able to have children. And that was a heartache for them for many years. And they found peace with it, and part of it was by saying, we're not going to have children, but we're going to bless people. Now, they never worked in the nursery. That wasn't their gift. But I wish I could tell you how many times, now, Pastor, you know, if there's a child in our church who needs something, they need to go to camp, or if they need to go, you make sure we know. And so I was able to record the video. I couldn't think of a better place out of their sorrow, something very positive to happen. God is still in control. And it made me think about another business meeting that I remember about 25 years ago. We were doing a building program, and we had voted on it. And we were going to expand the building, and we were going to join some buildings together. and we figured $350,000. And we raised it, we had it in pledges, it was coming in, we were good to go. And about, 2 months into the building project, we discovered that every bit of wiring in both of the buildings was substandard. Then we discovered that the sewers in the church really weren't very good either. And then they decided that since we were doing a new building and connected to the old buildings had to be brought up to code. Well, the bottom line was, we came to a business meeting where our $350,000 project had gone to $750,000. Let me tell you, that was one I was kind of excited about. And I mean, people were angry. They were upset. They were frustrated. How come you didn't know this? One man stood up. He said, Pastor, none of us are excited about this set of circumstances. But God was not surprised. We didn't know what was going to happen. We don't know where it was going to, but God was not surprised. God knew all along. And when we prayed and said, God, should we do this? And we felt He said yes, and we voted to do it. God was not surprised. He's still in control. Well, it was kind of painful to have to borrow the $350,000, and we paid it off in about 5 years, and looking back, it was one of the greatest things the church ever did. But when we understand that God is still in control, it changes things. He chose to see good in the midst of the circumstances. Romans 8:28, everybody quotes that. I mean, God, all things, God works together for good to those who love Him and are called according. You do know that that text does not say everything that happens is good. There's lots of stuff that happen that are not good in this world. But that verse says that even in the midst of difficult circumstances, God is still doing good things. Paul's first thing is, guess what? I'm in prison, didn't want to be here, but there are folks guarding me who come to know Jesus. Can you imagine being stuck with Paul for 4 hours? I mean, being chained to him or being in the house where he's at. What's he talking about? I mean, would he quit talking about Jesus? I mean, but there were some in the Imperial Guard, because that's who guarded imperial prisoners. And so there are people coming to know Jesus. And then he gets excited because I'm here and I'm preaching, and that's encouraging other people to preach too, and they're preaching. And then he goes on, and by the way, while he was in prison, evidently, some more of the bad circumstances, there were some Christian preachers who were bad-mouthing Paul, saying stuff like, well, if he was really godly, he wouldn't be in prison, would he? He must have been, he can't be a real prophet. Look where he's at. He's in jail. So they were running him down. Instead of being bitter about that, he says, well, I don't like what they're saying, but if they still preach Jesus, then I can rejoice in that. This idea of finding good in the midst of tragedy, in the midst of difficulty. I wish I could tell you a story. One of my greatest story of all, my very first full-time pastor was up in Chicago, and I was making a hospital visit to one of my members. And it was a mission church, and we didn't have very many people in the hospital because I think we had one person over the age of 60 in the entire church. Everybody was young. And I went to visit somebody in the hospital, and it was fine. We prayed, and the man in the next bed and his wife were there, and his wife was crying. And I just happened to be in the room, and so I walked over and talked to them and began to have a relationship and conversation, and she accepted Christ and he accepted Christ because I had visited this other family in the hospital. And by the way, a little bit later on, her mom and dad accepted Christ, and I had a chance to baptize them, and then 2 grandkids accepted Christ, and then there was a brother and a sister. I think I did 9 baptisms that all could be related back to that one bad event, somebody being in the hospital and God at work in the midst. That's the way it is. By the way, so he says, these guys are preaching, and they're not really preaching well, but they're talking about Jesus, which also kind of reminds me that I don't know how you feel about other churches, other denominations. There's kind of an old story about somebody went to heaven and they're getting the tour, and they get to a section. This is the Lutheran section, and this is the Methodist section, and then they get to one and say, and you have to be very quiet over here. This is the Baptist section, and they think they're the only ones here. Understand what I mean? There are other folks who do not exactly do church the way we do. And they don't have all the doctrines that we think probably are appropriate and right, and they may not do everything exactly like us. Listen to me. If they preach Jesus Christ, the Son of God, who died on the cross, who rose again on the third day, and can save people for all of eternity, they may not have every other duck in a row or not, but if they preach that, then we have some reason to rejoice. There's something about looking for good in the midst of tragic circumstances. And then, this is the last one. In the midst of his circumstances, Paul's just, at this point, he chooses to decide to be faithful for today and for tomorrow and until life comes to an end. Which kind of thing, whatever you aim at is probably what you're going to hit. You don't aim at anything. Paul aims to be faithful. Now understand, for him, you got to read into this. Before the end of the day, he may very well be before Caesar. He may be condemned to go to the arena and die in front of a crowd in some terrible way. We're not exactly sure that they did all of that during Paul's days, but he has no idea. But he says, I don't know what the rest of my life looks like. But my intention, and he kind of asks for their prayers. My intention is that whatever my life is, I want to be faithful. And if I'm going to die, I want to die faithful. And if I'm going to live, I want to live faithful. And I don't know about today, and I don't know about tomorrow, but my intention is no matter what's going on in my life, my goal, my intention is to be faithful to God all the way. And to be bold about my teaching, my name, my faith in Jesus Christ. Well, again, I hope today, I hope you're saying, man, that was a good preacher. That was fine. I didn't need it today. That's correct. That'd be super. Be thankful, be humble, hang in there. The Bible says man's days are few and filled with trouble. The difference is that you and I, with the help of Jesus Christ, with the help of his Spirit, with the strength, and by the way, Paul, I think this circumstance is going to play out. Philippians chapter 4:13. I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. Don't be anxious about anything. With prayer and supplication, let your request. You understand, it's all about this. I'm not where I want to be, but God is in control, and I'm going to trust him. So today, I want to encourage you, if you're holding on to any kind of bitterness, any kind of anger, this is a good place to let go. If things are just out of control, I mean, if it just was hard to get here this morning because of the things that you're facing with, I want to remind you, God is in control. And then I want you to keep your eyes on, look for God in the midst of it. Look for the hand of God. Look for the touch of God. Look for the blessing and the work of God that might occur even in the midst of where you're at and what you're doing. And then maybe this is it's the invitation and the commitment that I'd ask from you is a commitment to say, Lord, help me be faithful. Help me to keep trusting you. Help me to just keep my eyes fixed on you rather than the things that are happening all around me. I need to tell you, next week's not going to be a whole lot better. Because next week he's going to talk about, well, dying, that'd be good, because I'd go to heaven. But living, well, that could be good. And he's going to wrestle with this whole thing about life in this world and life in the next world. But I'm glad he wrote these things. Because probably you and I are going to need them. Today, not today, probably tomorrow or some other day, but I hope we never lose sight